A little boy vanished from a county fair in 1996, and for decades his family lived with silence instead of answers. The man who held the truth, carnival worker Calvin Rhodes, let fear and selfishness turn a child's life into a nightmare. But when his drunken confession cracked the case wide open, the past could no longer stay hidden. Just listen to how shocking this twist became, and how justice at last caught up with him. The August heat had begun to settle into a sticky haze by the time the Miller family stepped onto the fairgrounds. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement, but the carnival lights already blazed, pulsing in neon reds, blues, and greens. The smell of popcorn, frying oil, and cotton candy hung thick in the air, clinging to clothes and hair. People streamed past in restless waves, families with strollers, teenagers clutching stuffed animals, couples leaning into each other with plastic cups of soda in hand. The Miller family looked no different from 100 others, ordinary, happy, unsuspecting. Ethan Miller, 9 years old and restless with excitement, tugged insistently at his mother Linda's hand. His other hand clutched a folded ticket booklet, his prized possession for the night. "Come on, Mom," he urged, pointing toward the game stalls where a man in a striped vest barked promises of easy wins. His brown eyes shone with that mix of innocence and determination that children carry when they're sure their turn at luck has come. Jack Miller, Ethan's father, excused himself with a quick smile. "I'll grab us some lemonades. Be right back." He disappeared into the crowd, his tall frame vanishing quickly among a dozen others. Linda stayed with Ethan, adjusting the strap of her purse on her shoulder, distracted for a moment by the noise and lights around her. The music blaring from the carousel speakers blended with the squeals from the tilt-a-whirl, making it difficult to hold a steady thought. The ring-toss stall shimmered ahead, lit by bulbs strung in uneven rows. Ethan pulled forward, practically dragging his mother. "Just a few throws, please," he begged, bouncing on his toes. Linda laughed, unable to deny him. She handed over a few tickets, and Ethan gripped the rings with fierce concentration, his tongue peeking from the corner of his mouth. He missed, of course, once, twice, 3 times, but his laughter rang louder than the clatter of the rings hitting bottles. Linda's smile softened as she watched him. For that brief span of minutes, everything was perfect. The glow of the lights on Ethan's face, the joy in his laughter, the sense that childhood stretched endlessly ahead. Then, as quickly as perfection came, it slipped. A jostle from the side, 2 teenagers shoving past, knocking into Linda's arm, forced her to look away for only a heartbeat. When she turned back, Ethan wasn't at the counter. The stall attendant was busy calling out to another group of players, indifferent. Linda scanned left, then right, expecting to see her son only a step or 2 away. Nothing. "Ethan?" Her voice rose above the crowd's murmur, uncertain but not yet panicked. She walked a few steps forward, peering between clusters of people. Children darted everywhere, some holding balloons, others with melting cones of ice cream. For an instant, Linda thought she caught a glimpse of Ethan's red T-shirt vanishing between the bodies ahead. She pushed through, calling louder now. "Ethan?" Jack returned minutes later, balancing 3 lemonades in flimsy paper cups. He saw his wife's frantic expression before he understood her words. He was right here. Jack, he was right here. The cups fell, splattering sticky liquid onto the dirt. Together they scoured the nearby rides and booths, calling his name again and again, their voices breaking under the weight of rising fear. Security was alerted. Announcements crackled over loudspeakers, instructing people to keep watch for a missing boy in a red shirt and jeans. The carnival's bright lights now seemed sinister, casting sharp shadows that swallowed corners and pathways. Every stranger's face became suspect, every glimpse of a child a moment of false hope, followed by crushing disappointment. As hours dragged on, police arrived, flashlights cutting through the thinning crowd. They searched beneath bleachers, behind trailers, inside storage sheds, but each sweep ended in silence. Linda clutched Ethan's small backpack, found abandoned near the midway, as if holding it could somehow summon him back. Jack moved like a man already broken, eyes glassy, words clipped. The fair shut down early, music silenced, rides halted mid-spin. But Ethan Miller was nowhere. By sunrise, when the searchers' voices had grown hoarse and the parents' bodies numb with exhaustion, the reality settled in like a physical weight. The boy had been swallowed by the carnival itself, erased in the very place meant to be safe and joyous. That night became a fracture in time. For the Miller family, there was a before, filled with laughter, small arguments, bedtime stories, and plans for the future. And there was the after, a hollow space where none of those things seemed possible anymore. In 20 short minutes, a child had vanished, and with him went the fragile scaffolding of a family's world. The disappearance of Ethan Miller was not simply an event that passed. It was a wound that never closed. In the first days after the fair, Springfield was alive with urgency. Neighbors taped flyers to storefront windows, light poles, and the walls of gas stations. The boy's smile, captured in a school photograph where his hair stuck up at the crown, stared out from hundreds of photocopies. "Missing," the posters read, followed by a plea. "If you've seen Ethan, call the police immediately." But as the weeks wore on and the tips led nowhere, the posters began to curl at the edges, the ink fading under sun and rain. Some tore in half, flapping limply on poles as if mocking the very effort. People still noticed them, but they stopped looking closely. That was the first cruel truth of such cases. The world did not pause for grief. The Miller family's pain stretched endlessly, but the town's life moved forward. Inside the Miller home, however, time did not move. Linda sat for hours at the kitchen table, staring at the phone, willing it to ring with news. She recorded every call on a small notepad, even wrong numbers, afraid that missing a detail might mean losing a chance to find her son. Jack responded differently. He threw himself into activity. He called detectives daily, retraced steps at the fairgrounds, demanded updates from anyone remotely connected to the investigation. His determination, though fierce, was not born of hope, but of desperation, as if by sheer force he could bend the world into giving him an answer. The police worked tirelessly in the beginning. Detectives combed through the carnival's employees, interviewed fairgoers, and checked sex offender registries in 3 surrounding counties. They followed up on dozens of tips. A child seen at a rest stop off Channel 70, a boy matching Ethan's description wandering in Cincinnati, a strange man offering balloons near a schoolyard. Each lead ended the same way: false sightings, mistaken identity, or dead ends. After 6 months, the case lost its momentum. Officers rotated to other investigations, and new crimes demanded attention. Ethan's file, once active and urgent, was placed into the cabinet reserved for unsolved cases. It became what detectives grimly called a haunting, a case that gnawed at memory but offered nothing to hold on to. For the community, the fairgrounds themselves changed meaning. Parents who once saw the event as harmless family fun now kept their children close, eyes darting at every unfamiliar face. Some refused to go at all. Vendors complained that attendance dropped in the years following, and whispers spread that the fair had become cursed, tainted by what had happened. That sense of unease never fully disappeared. Theories sprang up, each more desperate than the last. Some believed Ethan had simply wandered off, lost in the crowd, and perhaps met with an accident that left him hidden where no one thought to look. Others argued he had been abducted by a stranger who slipped away into the night, blending into the anonymity of passing cars. But the most unsettling rumor, one that simmered quietly, unspoken in public, but whispered in kitchens and over fences, was that someone inside the carnival itself had taken him. The carnival workers were outsiders, drifters who moved from county to county, never staying long enough to become familiar. They lived in trailers and cheap motels, their lives transient and often invisible to the communities they entertained. For many locals, it was easier to suspect them than to believe one of their own could be responsible. Still, police could not prove anything. The workers were interviewed, their names recorded, but with so many moving parts and so little evidence, the possibility hung unresolved. Had the predator walked among the cotton candy stalls, spinning rides for children while hiding darker intentions? Meanwhile, the Miller family fractured under the pressure. Linda withdrew, her grief becoming an anchor she could not shed. Jack, frustrated by silence and haunted by guilt he had only left for lemonade, began drinking heavily. Their conversations turned to arguments, arguments to silence, and soon the house was divided by more than sorrow. Within 3 years, they filed for divorce. Friends spoke of it in hushed voices, not out of judgment but recognition. Grief like theirs rarely left anything intact. The community carried its own guilt. Teachers remembered Ethan's empty desk and hesitated before calling on his classmates, unsure whether to speak of him or let his absence remain a quiet ghost. Churches prayed for him in the first year, then prayed less as time passed. Neighbors baked casseroles for the Millers at first, but as months stretched into years, they stopped knocking on the door, uncertain of what to say. Grief, when prolonged, isolates the grieving. Even in its cold status, the case did not disappear. Every so often, a television program would feature Ethan's photo in a montage of missing children. Each time, Linda would sit rigid before the screen, heart hammering, as if this time the segment might contain something new. It never did. But she kept every clip, every article, in a box beneath her bed, a shrine of sorts to persistence. Detectives who inherited the file later admitted it was a case that haunted them. "He just vanished," one recalled. No trace, no struggle, no explanation. A boy doesn't just disappear from a crowded fair. Somebody saw something. We just never found who. That gnawing absence, the lack of even a shred of closure, was what made the case unforgettable. By the early 2000s, Ethan's image had aged through computer rendering software, showing what he might look like as a teenager. Those digitally aged photos were printed on new flyers, posted again on boards and shop windows, but they never stirred more than a flicker of recognition. Still, Linda saved them all. To her, Ethan was not just a photograph frozen in time, but a living boy who must still be somewhere. And so the mystery lingered, heavy and unresolved. Every summer when the fair returned, people remembered. Parents held children closer. Some stayed away altogether, saying the place still felt haunted. The lights and music could disguise many things, but they could not erase the memory of one boy who entered and never came back. The unanswered question remained like a thorn. Had Ethan been taken by chance, a random tragedy of circumstance? Or had he fallen into the hands of someone who belonged there, hidden in plain sight among the carnival's painted smiles and flashing rides? The absence of truth was its own kind of presence, a shadow stretching long across the years. Calvin Rhodes was never the kind of man people remembered clearly. He blended into backgrounds, leaving only vague impressions. Tall, thin, with sunken cheeks and hair that always seemed greasy, no matter the hour. He worked the carnival circuit not out of love for the atmosphere or skill with rides, but because it was the only place that asked no questions. He drifted from fairground to fairground like smoke, disappearing before anyone thought to look closely. In 1996, Calvin was 22, yet he carried himself with the weariness of someone much older. His childhood had been marked by instability. Parents who moved constantly, jobs lost as quickly as they were found, nights spent in cars or temporary shelters. By the time he reached adulthood, he had inherited a worldview built on impermanence. Nothing was meant to last. Not homes, not jobs, not relationships. He understood only movement. Carnival life suited him in that sense. It was transient, chaotic, never fixed. Workers came and went, rarely prying into one another's histories. Pay was small, but meals were included, and a cot in a shared trailer meant a roof over his head. Calvin learned to set up rides, haul equipment, and patch broken parts with duct tape and wire. He had a knack for improvisation, though his supervisors often complained he lacked discipline. Still, he lingered on the edges, tolerated more than respected. When police began questioning Carnival employees after Ethan Miller's disappearance, Calvin's name came up, but only faintly. He had been there, yes, but he was quiet, forgettable. Some co-workers remembered him drinking from a flask during breaks. Others recalled him sleeping in odd places, curled beneath bleachers or behind storage trailers. He was never where he was supposed to be, but never openly defiant either, a shadow among louder personalities. By the time detectives followed the thread to him, Calvin had already slipped away, hitching a ride with another traveling show. It wasn't deliberate evasion, at least not at first, but rather instinct. When questions started pressing too close, his reflex was to move on. That tendency became a pattern, one that left him always a step beyond reach. Years blurred into decades. The Carnival that once offered shelter became less forgiving. Younger workers replaced him, supervisors grew tired of his unreliability, and the industry itself shrank under changing times. Calvin never built stability elsewhere. He took odd jobs when he could, loading trucks, sweeping lots, doing repair work that paid under the table. He drank more, ate less, and watched the years carve lines into his face that made him look decades older than he was. By 2019, Calvin was 50 and looked closer to 70. His life had narrowed to a bleak routine: cheap motel rooms rented by the week, dim bars where the jukebox played old country songs, and mornings spent staring into cracked mirrors, wondering how much longer he could drift before his body simply gave out. Those who met him then described a man hollowed by regret and liquor, with eyes that seemed to focus on something just beyond the present moment. Despite his invisibility, Calvin's name never fully left the margins of Ethan Miller's case file. Investigators, especially the younger ones who inherited the cold case years later, circled it. They noted the timing, the proximity, the way he vanished just as questions sharpened. He was never elevated to suspect, but never dismissed either. He lingered in that gray space, unreliable, slippery, hard to pin down. What made Calvin different from other Carnival drifters was not criminal history. He had none of significance, but the way people struggled to describe him. He seemed to generate unease without effort, a man whose presence left no memory except discomfort. One officer who interviewed him briefly in another county years after the fair described him in her notes as slippery, evasive, like trying to hold water in your hands. Beneath that slipperiness, however, was something else, a gnawing guilt that Calvin never admitted but could not outrun. He carried himself like a man who expected confrontation, who avoided eye contact not out of shyness but out of fear of being recognized. He stayed mobile because standing still meant being found. And though no warrant was ever issued, no charges filed, he lived as if hunted, not by the law, but by something heavier, lodged deep in memory. By the time his life reached its final decline, Calvin had become exactly what investigators feared he always would: a broken man no longer capable of running, haunted by the past he carried like a lead weight. He existed in the margins of society, but his name, faint and flickering, never entirely left the shadowed pages of Ethan Miller's story. For years, he remained nothing more than that shadow. A drifter, a ghost, a man defined not by what he had done, but by what others could never quite prove. And yet, like the unanswered case itself, his presence was a reminder that some truths never stay buried forever. The diner off Route 40 wasn't the sort of place that attracted attention. Its neon sign sputtered more often than it glowed, and the paint on the siding had long since faded to a dull, water-streaked gray. Truckers pulled in at all hours for bitter coffee, locals drifted through for cheap breakfasts, but no one came here to be noticed, which is perhaps why Calvin Rhodes chose it, or stumbled into it, on that particular evening in late autumn, 2019. The waitress on shift, a woman named Marlene who had been serving pie and refilling mugs there for 20 years, later described him as broken before he even walked through the door. He shuffled in unsteady, smelling of whiskey and cigarettes, his clothes wrinkled as though he'd slept in them for days. He sat at the counter, ordered nothing but black coffee, and stared into the steaming cup as if it might scald away whatever thoughts gnawed at him. At first, his words made no sense. He muttered about being tired, about the past never leaving him alone, about a boy with brown eyes who had laughed at a ring toss once. Marlene nodded politely, used to the rambling of half-drunken patrons. But then Calvin leaned across the counter, gripping the edge with trembling hands, and whispered something that made her blood run cold. "I did something terrible back in '96. I can't carry it any more." For a moment she thought he was simply drunk and talking nonsense, but when she asked what he meant, his eyes filled with tears, and his voice dropped to a hoarse rasp. "The boy from the fair. Ethan. I didn't kill him, but I kept him." Marlene froze. She knew the story. Everyone in that region knew it. Ethan Miller's face had been on flyers, in newspapers, even on the evening news for years. The boy who vanished without a trace from the Springfield Fair. Now, decades later, a ragged man was confessing in her diner? She excused herself under the pretense of fetching more coffee, retreated to the kitchen, and dialed the sheriff. When deputies arrived, Calvin didn't resist. In fact, he seemed almost relieved, as though being led from the diner in handcuffs was lighter than the burden he had carried inside. He mumbled half-sentences as they loaded him into the cruiser. Tried to feed him, couldn't let him go. He was supposed to be safe. None of it formed a full picture, only fragments of a nightmare. At the sheriff's office, under harsh fluorescent lights, the interrogation began. Calvin sat hunched in the metal chair, his eyes bloodshot, his hands twitching as though he was always about to bolt but never could. Detectives pressed him over and over, demanding clarity. The timeline, the motive, the truth. For hours, he resisted. He contradicted himself, fell silent, muttered prayers under his breath. But as dawn crept through the blinds, his will cracked. The sobbing came first, deep, wrenching sobs that shook his thin frame. He covered his face with his hands like a child, rocking back and forth, repeating that he hadn't meant to hurt anyone. "I didn't kill him," he insisted, voice breaking. "I swear to God I didn't kill that boy." Then, piece by piece, the confession emerged. Ethan hadn't been taken by some faceless stranger and killed in a dark corner, as many had long assumed. Calvin claimed he had taken him, yes, but not to kill. "I kept him," he whispered. "I didn't know what else to do." The words chilled the room. Detectives exchanged glances, but let him continue. Calvin described a trailer, one of the nondescript storage units that followed the carnival from town to town, filled with tools and spare parts. Only this one, he admitted, had held something else: a child. The boy had been locked inside while the carnival traveled across the Midwest, hidden in plain sight behind padlocks and peeling paint. Calvin said he had tried to care for him, bringing scraps of food, old blankets, even crayons once. But fear ruled every decision. Fear of being caught, fear of what the carnival bosses might do if they discovered the truth, fear of facing the law. "I thought I could figure it out," he said through tears. "But every day it got harder, and I didn't know how to make it right." Detectives pressed him for details: where the trailer had gone, how long Ethan had been inside, why no one else knew. Calvin's answers came in broken pieces, disjointed but threaded with an unmistakable ring of truth. He claimed he had been young, stupid, desperate to have control over something in a life that had always spun beyond his reach. Ethan, he said, became that terrible secret, that impossible responsibility. By the end of the interrogation, Calvin's face was streaked with tears, his voice raw from confession. The detectives had not yet verified a word of it, but the weight in the room was unmistakable. After 23 years, the shadow that had loomed over Springfield had finally begun to speak. And the story it told was darker, stranger, and more horrifying than anyone had imagined. They found the trailer by following a ragged thread: maintenance logs, a retired ride operator's memory of license plate fragments, a sheriff's detective who remembered a Carnival Cruise winter layover in Johnson County. The trail had the quality of old film, faint, scratched, a handful of frames that only made sense when arranged just so. Calvin Rhodes's name appeared at the seams, payroll stubs from 1996, a motel receipt with a hand-scrawled nickname, a drunken tip from a former coworker who'd kept a grudge. The detectives moved on that thread with the quiet intensity of people who have carried a case in the back of their heads for years. Their work not showy, but single-minded, a labor of reconstruction and patience. The junkyard sat in a flat, wind-scrubbed parcel outside Indianapolis, rows of hulks and bone-white chassis glittering under the late autumn sun. A man named Harlan ran it, broad-shouldered, apron stained with oil, a face like old wood, and he led the squad between rusting sedans to the trailer. It crouched among wrecks and discarded signs, a long, boxy thing with pitted aluminum skin and a single, stubborn padlock on the door. Its sides were a map of other people's summers, smeared festival logos, curling bumper stickers, faded vendor tags that had clung for decades. None of it should have been ominous. It was only a storage unit. But the detective who had briefed the Millers for years felt the hair rise along his arms as he approached. They secured the perimeter like a crime scene, unfurling bright tape that looked absurd in the junkyard's open bleakness. Photographers crouched with cameras that hummed and blinked, collecting angles of the trailer's exterior. Scorched paint, a dent where someone had hypothetically bumped it in 2002, a padlock that had shed enough rust to suggest long neglect rather than recent tampers. A forensic tech photographed serial numbers beneath half-peeled stickers. Another logged the trailer's VIN. Everything was cataloged with methodical care. The cooler near the hitch, a rag with an oily smear, the way a gull feather had worked itself into a wheel well. The choreography of evidence preservation was precise. Gloves, boot covers, sterile bagging, the hush of professionals who knew how quickly a scene could become contamination if handled without discipline. They tried the padlock first with bolt cutters, formal, blunt, part of the ritual. The metal groaned, the cutter teeth bit and slipped. Someone suggested a grinder. The grinder's first note sliced the yard, high, metallic, urgent. Sparks spun like brittle fireflies against the aluminum flanks. The whine of the blade made everyone flinch, a sound that implied demolition but promised discovery. The man operating the tool worked methodically, breathing in short, concentrated bursts, his brow furrowed beneath safety goggles. Heat washed off the grinder in waves. The freshly exposed metal smelled like ozone and hot iron, the air thickening with the copper sting of it. When the lock finally surrendered, an abrupt clack followed by the metallic snap of a broken shackle. The quiet that followed was almost physical. They did not open immediately. One detective pressed a palm to the trailer door as if testing for a pulse, then stepped back to give space. Procedures mattered here. They mattered because a single misstep could destroy a trace or a memory. An evidence tech snapped photographs of the padlock in place, then again at the snap, each angle providing a record that would be replayed in courtrooms or hung in superintendent's reports. A leader murmured a terse instruction, and two deputies eased the heavy door upward on its hinges. Light did not so much enter the trailer as it was forced into itself. A flashlight beam cut through the interior darkness and laid bare a narrow box of black. The smell that escaped was layered and immediate, old dust, a sourness of long stale fabric, something like metal warmed by time. For a fraction of a second, the detectives simply stood with their lights leveled inside, their beams trembling only slightly as they surveyed what would, by right, be ordinary space. It was the silence that struck. No sound of rodents, no scuttle of hidden things, only the soft intake of breath among the men and women standing at the threshold. Then the reactions unfolded, uncoordinated and human. One older sergeant, grim, practiced, the sort who had seen too many scenes to be surprised, suddenly placed a hand over his mouth as if to hold back what wanted out. A noise, a prayer, a curse. A rookie's knees buckled and he sank onto an overturned tire, hands braced on his thighs, face gone white. A woman detective unclipped her radio and, with a voice that was almost contradictorily steady, called for a supervisor and a forensic lead. Someone vomited behind a stack of pallets. Someone else walked away and inhaled air as if pulling salt through their lungs. For a moment, the only constant was the whisper of brush against denim, the rustle of gloves, the soft, sharp clicks of camera shutters that tried to do a job words could not. They had prepared for an ordinary storage inspection and encountered something that made the ordinary impossible. The collective intake of breath was not only shock, but the opening of a wound in a long-held assumption. That time had smoothed over the missing pieces. Motives reasserted themselves in the minds of those present. Duty to a family that had waited decades. The professional need to secure proof that could finally make private grief public and prosecutable. Each officer's face registered those motivations differently. Quiet fury, a tight, disciplined sorrow, a cold calculus that translated emotion into procedure. Nobody spoke for a long minute. The yard's noises, an occasional clank of discarded metal, a distant truck, seemed foreign, as though the place had become an island where normal sounds were muffled. When the lead detective finally ordered the interior to be secured and the forensic team to begin cataloging, his voice was low and steady, an attempt at control in a moment that felt anything but. They crossed the threshold with measured steps, gloves sliding into place, evidence bags unrolled and ready. The outside world waited, callers, families, the sharp glare of media. But for those minutes, the trailer was its own universe, a closed thing from which an answer had to be wrested. They did not yet know how the evening would end. They only knew, with the same stubborn clarity that had carried them to the junkyard, that once whatever lay inside was documented, the hollow in Springfield's years-long ache would no longer be only an ache. It would finally be something that could be named. The beam of a flashlight slid across the interior, catching on the first object with devastating clarity. A backpack, small, faded red, its canvas worn to a softness that only years of handling could bring. The initials EM, once bright in permanent marker, had dulled into faint gray letters. It lay collapsed on its side, one strap twisted as if it had been pulled hastily from a shoulder and dropped. A detective crouched, gloved hands trembling slightly, and photographed the bag from 3 angles before lifting it into an evidence sack. Inside they found notebooks with childish scrawl, the stub of a pencil, and candy wrappers long brittle with age. For all its fragility, it was unmistakably a boy's world, frozen in miniature. A few feet away, beside a wall where the aluminum bore the faint outlines of moisture stains, sat a pair of sneakers. They were impossibly small in comparison to the hulking frame of the trailer. The rubber soles had thinned nearly to nothing, the laces frayed. One shoe was untied, the bow loose, as if its wearer had taken them off in a hurry, or perhaps grown restless with the repetitive action of tying and untying. Forensics brushed away layers of dust, taking samples, photographing tread patterns, and sealing each shoe separately. The detectives knew, without words, that these weren't just artifacts. They were timestamps of a life interrupted at 9 years old. The flashlight beams moved higher, cutting across the trailer walls. Patches of curling tape clung stubbornly to the aluminum, securing sheets of paper colored in waxy strokes. Crayon drawings, untouched for decades, remained faint but legible. A crooked house with smoke puffing from the chimney, a stick-figure family standing beneath a sun drawn too large, a scribbled carnival ride rendered in shaky lines. Some were taped in clusters, overlapping slightly, as though arranged by small hands trying to make the cold metal space feel like a room, a place to live rather than a cage. The detectives stared at them longer than protocol required, a silence thickening in the space as they considered what it meant for a child to create comfort in confinement. Each drawing was photographed meticulously, the camera clicks strangely loud in the suffocating quiet. Then came the cot. Wedged into the far corner, it was a simple fold-out frame of metal with a thin mattress, its fabric yellowed with age. The blanket draped across it had stiffened, more relic than textile now, and smelled faintly of mildew. The cot's bars bore marks where the paint had been rubbed off, as if a restless body had clutched or kicked against them, over and over. A small pillow sat askew, its stuffing hardened into lumps. To see a bed in that setting, utilitarian, improvised, and inescapably child-sized, was to realize the grotesque reality of what the space had been used for. Not storage, but captivity. It was the door, however, that spoke loudest. When technicians leaned close and shined their lights along the inner surface, the scratches appeared. Dozens, maybe hundreds, some shallow, others deep enough to bend the soft metal. They weren't random. They were clustered near the edges, around the lock and hinges, the places where a child's logic might believe pressure could make an opening. Tiny fingernail marks had caught grime and rust over years, frozen testimony of frantic, desperate effort. Forensics dusted the grooves, swabbed particles, and measured lengths, documenting everything with an intensity that bordered on reverence. The scratches didn't need interpretation. They were the language of a boy begging the world to let him out. The investigators moved carefully, but each item told its story before anyone spoke. No one had to explain the significance of a backpack left behind, of shoes that had no feet to fill them, of childish drawings stuck to a prison wall. The room itself seemed to echo with absence. For seasoned officers, men and women who had waded through scenes of homicide, abuse, and wreckage, there was still a unique brutality in the ordinariness of what they saw. These weren't instruments of violence. They were relics of normalcy, twisted only by the context in which they existed. One detective finally lowered his camera and muttered, almost inaudibly, that it was like time had been stopped. He wasn't wrong. The space had the air of suspension, as though Ethan's life had been paused mid-sentence and left to linger in the stale dark for 23 years. Each artifact was more than evidence. It was the continuation of a boy's voice, one that had been silenced too soon, but left traces strong enough to be heard by anyone willing to look closely. The forensic team sealed the space, bagging every object with the kind of care usually reserved for fragile antiques. Yet what they handled wasn't delicate because of age. It was delicate because of weight. Emotional, historical, human. Every piece of evidence was a fragment of Ethan's final days, the tangible outline of what his family had been forced to imagine for decades. And in those scratches on the door, those desperate, jagged etchings, they found the most painful confirmation of all. Ethan had been alive. He had fought. He had wanted to go home. The trailer no longer looked like a shell of rust and stickers. To the detectives, it had transformed into a monument to captivity, a capsule of grief preserved under metal skin. What they carried out that night was more than evidence. It was the undeniable truth of a child's stolen existence, truth that would not let anyone present walk away unchanged. The announcement broke like a thunderclap. Within hours of the trailer's discovery, the story had leapt from local broadcasts in Ohio and Indiana to the national stage. Cable news, morning shows, late-night programs. Each outlet displayed the same jarring images. A rusted storage trailer cordoned off by yellow tape, crime scene technicians in white suits hauling out evidence bags, and still photographs of Ethan Miller, forever 9 years old, his smile preserved. In yearbook gloss, for many Americans, the case had been a half-forgotten mystery, a headline from the mid-90s that faded with time. Now it was back, sharp and unbearable, with answers that only deepened the wound. The fury ignited first in Springfield. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse and the sheriff's office, holding candles and posters of Ethan's face. Parents who remembered warning their own children after 1996 now stood shoulder to shoulder with their grown sons and daughters, voices cracking with outrage. How could nobody see, they demanded. How could an entire carnival crew travel the Midwest with a child hidden in a trailer and no one say a word? The anger wasn't abstract. It was personal. The fair had been a place of trust, of family outings and laughter, and to learn that it had doubled as a cover for captivity felt like betrayal by the very fabric of small-town life. Commentators on television fanned the flames further. Experts in law enforcement questioned how background checks, even in the 90s, had failed to flag someone like Calvin Rhodes, a drifter with a record of petty theft and public intoxication. Advocates for missing children's causes appeared on panels, their voices rising with indignation. The system had failed Ethan, failed his parents, failed every child whose flyer had yellowed on a telephone pole. Some asked whether carnivals, with their transient workforces and unregulated living quarters, had long been overlooked havens for exploitation. The public, already raw with disbelief, turned its suspicion not just on Calvin, but on every nameless worker who had shared the road with him. Calvin Rhodes became the central figure of hatred, his mugshot plastered across every network, his name spat with venom in online forums. When reporters replayed the transcript of his confession, the outrage sharpened into something nearly physical. He had claimed, through sobs, that he had looked after Ethan at first, feeding him, talking to him, trying to convince himself he was providing care. But when Ethan grew sick, fevered and frail, Calvin said he panicked. He was terrified the boy's death would expose him. One night, in a storm of cowardice, he abandoned the trailer in an Indianapolis lot and never returned. To the public, this explanation was worse than murder. It suggested Ethan hadn't been killed in an instant of violence, but left to wither in solitude, his cries ignored until silence swallowed them. The scratches on the trailer door, now widely circulated in photographs, became symbols of fury. Parents looked at them and saw their own children's hands, clawing for escape. Strangers wept openly at the thought of a boy who might have lived for weeks, even months, waiting for someone to notice the sounds coming from a carnival storage trailer. The carnival community, too, came under fire. How could dozens of workers pass through the same trailers, sleep in the same fields, load and unload the same equipment, and never realize what was happening inside one of their own? Some claimed ignorance, insisting Calvin had kept to himself that the trailer had seemed locked and off-limits. Others admitted rumors had circulated, whispers of strange noises, of Rhodes's erratic behavior. But no one pressed, no one intervened. Their silence now looked like complicity. Talk shows condemned the culture of looking away, the tendency to avoid questions in itinerant communities where secrets could hide in plain sight. For the Miller family, the outrage was a cruel mix of validation and devastation. Jack Miller, gray-haired now, told reporters he had always believed his son hadn't simply vanished, that someone, somewhere, had known. His voice, though, trembled with restrained fury as he asked why it had taken 23 years for the truth to surface. Linda Miller, her face lined with grief that had never healed, stood silently beside him at the press conference, clutching a photo of Ethan in both hands as if anchoring herself to the boy she lost. To them, Calvin's claim of looking after Ethan was an obscenity. Care was what parents gave, what community gave. To steal a child and call it protection was to twist language into something monstrous. Nationwide, the case became less about one boy and one drifter, and more about a collective fear. That ordinary spaces could hide horrors, that indifference could allow them to thrive. Hashtags trended, petitions circulated, and editorials demanded reforms for traveling entertainment industries. But beneath the policy debates burned a rawer emotion, the image of a boy's crayon drawings taped to the walls of a cage. That image struck deeper than words. It reminded every viewer that Ethan had not only been trapped, but had tried to make a home, to hold on to fragments of normalcy, until neglect and cowardice extinguished him. By the time protests spread beyond Ohio, outside courthouses in Indiana, Illinois, even as far as Kansas, the tone had shifted from shock to fury. Calvin Rhodes was no longer just a broken drifter. He was a symbol of every adult who had failed a child by choosing fear, silence, or convenience. The nation demanded not only justice but explanation, something strong enough to contain the anger that pulsed in every headline and every vigil. Yet explanations, like apologies, felt impossibly small against the enormity of what Ethan had endured in that trailer. And so the fury grew, unrelenting, until the courts and the public alike were forced to reckon with the full weight of the truth. The press conference was supposed to bring closure. Instead, it opened wounds that had never really healed. Linda Miller stood at the podium, shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of both past and present. Her hands shook when she unfolded the paper she had prepared, but in the end she didn't read from it. She only lifted her eyes toward the cameras, her voice barely above a whisper. He was so close all those years. The sentence fractured the room. Reporters who had come armed with questions scribbled instead in silence. To hear a mother acknowledge that her son, her boy, stolen at 9, might have lived in confinement for longer than anyone dared to imagine, was unbearable. Linda's grief wasn't fresh. It was old grief dragged into daylight, reshaped by the cruelty of truth. For decades, she had lived with uncertainty, haunted by every theory, every half-promise of a lead. Now, the uncertainty was gone, replaced by something worse: knowledge. She pressed the photo of Ethan against her chest, as though she might shield him even now. The picture was a school portrait: chipped front tooth, cowlick at the crown, smile both awkward and radiant. Linda had carried that photo to vigils, to detective briefings, to anniversaries where the crowd grew smaller each year. For her, Ethan was still that age. He had never grown older, never entered middle school, never rebelled as a teenager, never learned to drive. To discover he had lived beyond that picture, only in captivity, was to lose him twice. Jack Miller stood beside her, his posture stiff but not unfeeling. Age had carved lines into his face, softened the edges of his anger into weariness, yet in this moment his fury was unmistakable. For years after Ethan's disappearance, Jack had turned his rage inward, against Linda, against himself, against a marriage that dissolved under pressure. They had spoken rarely since the divorce, their lives diverging into silence. But the trailer's discovery pulled them back into the same orbit, bound again by the boy who had once been the center of everything. Jack's voice carried differently from Linda's, rough, deliberate, almost defiant. "We trusted the system," he said, looking past the cameras as though addressing the faceless machinery of law enforcement, courts, agencies. "We trusted the people whose job it was to find children, to follow leads, to protect families like ours. And they failed. They failed Ethan. They failed us." His words trembled at the edges, but the anger in them was steady. The crowd absorbed the moment with a reverence usually reserved for funerals. Journalists noted how, for the first time in decades, Linda and Jack stood together. Their proximity was not reconciliation. It was survival. Pain had eroded everything else, but on this day, they needed each other to stand upright. Behind their anger lay layers of private torment. Linda thought of the birthdays she had marked with a cake no one ate, the stockings she hung each Christmas, even when Jack told her it was unhealthy. She thought of the nights she kept Ethan's bedroom exactly as he'd left it, until eventually she packed it away piece by piece, like sealing a wound. She had begged for answers, prayed for miracles, and sometimes even wished for finality in the form of a body. Now she had finality, but it came wrapped in images of a locked trailer, crayon drawings, and desperate scratches on metal. Jack's torment was different, rooted in guilt. He had been the one to buy lemonade the night Ethan vanished. He replayed those minutes endlessly. What if he had hurried? What if he had insisted Ethan stay in sight? What if? Over the years, the guilt hardened into bitterness, and the bitterness hollowed him. The discovery of the trailer didn't absolve him. It amplified the self-recrimination. "If I'd been faster," he confided to a reporter afterward, "maybe none of this would have happened." Their shared fury extended beyond Calvin Rhodes, though his name carried venom in their mouths. Calvin had stolen their son, yes, but the system had allowed him to vanish, allowed the trailer to move across state lines, allowed whispers to die uninvestigated. Linda spoke of detectives who rotated off the case, of evidence misplaced, of tips ignored because they seemed implausible. "We screamed for someone to listen," she said, "and they told us to be patient. While our boy was trapped in that box, The room thickened with emotion. Some reporters wept silently behind their notepads. Activists held up signs outside the courthouse demanding reforms. For Linda and Jack, though, there was no reform strong enough to compensate for 23 stolen years. Their anger was not policy-driven. It was elemental, parental, a howl against the universe that had conspired to keep Ethan hidden from them until it was too late. When the conference ended, Linda leaned slightly into Jack, her hand gripping his arm. It was not a gesture of reconciliation, but of exhaustion. Two people clinging to the only other soul who truly understood the magnitude of the loss. Their marriage had not survived Ethan's disappearance, but their grief bound them in ways time and anger could not dissolve. As they stepped away from the microphones, the cameras clicked furiously, freezing the image of two aging parents united in sorrow. For the first time in decades, they faced the world not separately, but together, haunted, furious, and holding each other up against the weight of truth. The courthouse in Clark County had seen its share of trials, but none in recent memory carried the gravity of State versus Calvin Rhodes. From the first day of jury selection, the halls were crowded with reporters, protesters, and curious citizens who had followed Ethan Miller's case since 1996. The atmosphere was heavy, almost theatrical, though the subject at its center was anything but performance. Calvin Rhodes, gaunt and trembling, sat at the defense table with the posture of a man who had long since surrendered to inevitability. He wore a plain gray suit that hung awkwardly on his frame, his hair thinning, his eyes hollow. He looked less like a predator and more like a broken remnant of a man. But no one in that courtroom was prepared to confuse appearances with absolution. The prosecution opened with a blunt narrative. They told the jury that Calvin had stolen a child from his parents, locked him in a trailer, and then abandoned him to die. They displayed photographs of the trailer on screens, showing the jurors every detail. The cot pressed against the corner, the backpack with Ethan's initials stitched on the flap, the faded crayon drawings taped to the walls. And then, almost cruelly but necessarily, they focused on the scratches, the tiny, desperate markings etched into metal, the silent testimony of a child who had wanted only to go home. The prosecutor's voice hardened as he described them. These are Ethan Miller's final words, written not in ink or pencil, but in pain and hopelessness. The defense attempted a softer framing. They painted Calvin as a frightened young man, only 22 at the time, who had made a catastrophic mistake. They argued he hadn't planned a murder, hadn't intended cruelty. They described him as a drifter raised without stability, a man who thought, naively, foolishly, that he could care for Ethan in secret, only to realize he was in over his head. His panic, they claimed, led him to abandon the boy rather than face the consequences. It was not malice, they insisted, but fear. But fear was no shield against the images the jury carried in their minds. Day after day, witnesses chipped away at the defense's fragile narrative. Former carnival workers described Calvin as erratic, secretive, prone to drinking even then. A forensics expert testified that Ethan could not have survived without medical attention during the period of illness Calvin described. Medical reports suggested suffering that stretched over time, not an abrupt end. Every fact reinforced the image of a boy neglected into oblivion while the man responsible looked away. Perhaps the most devastating testimony came from Linda Miller herself. She took the stand with her voice breaking, holding up the photograph of Ethan she had carried for decades. "You call it fear," she told the courtroom, staring at Calvin. "But fear doesn't lock a child in a box. Fear doesn't drive away and leave him scratching at the door for someone to save him. That isn't fear. That's cruelty." Her words hung in the air, unchallengeable, unsoftened by legal arguments. Even the defense attorney bowed his head. The jury's deliberations were brief, their verdict unsurprising. Guilty on all counts: kidnapping, unlawful confinement, and charges tied to the reckless endangerment of a minor. The sentencing phase became less about debate and more about gravity. The prosecution asked for life, arguing that Calvin's actions had not just taken a life, but stolen the future of an innocent boy, and inflicted wounds on a family and community that would never fully heal. The defense begged for leniency, citing remorse and Calvin's shattered state. When the judge delivered the sentence, life in prison, there was no applause, no cathartic release. The room was silent, absorbing the weight of the decision. Calvin slumped, his face buried in his hands, a muted sob escaping his lips. He had lived much of his life in flight, avoiding consequence, but the escape had finally ended. The sheriff's deputies led him away, chains rattling softly, as though punctuating the finality of the moment. For the Miller family, the verdict was both validation and futility. Justice, in the legal sense, had been served, but it could not restore Ethan, could not erase the years of not knowing, could not undo the images of a trailer where a child had spent his final days. Linda wept quietly, her head bowed against Jack's shoulder, while Jack stared forward, his jaw clenched tight. Neither smiled, neither sighed in relief. They accepted the outcome as one accepts the turning of a page, inevitable, necessary, but empty of comfort. Outside, the crowds reacted differently. Some cheered the life sentence as overdue justice. Others held candles in silence, honoring Ethan's memory rather than Calvin's punishment. News outlets broadcast the decision nationwide, their headlines stark and uncompromising. Drifter sentenced to life for 1996, kidnapping of Springfield boy. But beneath the headlines, in living rooms and kitchen tables across the country, people spoke in hushed voices about the horror of what had been revealed and the fragility of the